So continuing with Chapter 4, this is the 5th screencast, and it's about the use of growth models, population growth models. And as it says here in the caption, these models help ecologists understand population changes. These are mathematical models, and it allows scientists to predict changes in population size by understanding population size changes that have occurred in the past and applying mathematical formulas to what might happen in the future. You don't need to worry about the mathematical formulas. We're just going to walk through the different types of growth models. The first one here is exponential growth model. So when a population is not limited by resources, there's plenty of food, water, nesting sites, etc., growth can be very rapid due to the fact that there will be many births. And that type of curve is called an exponential curve or a J-shaped curve. And we'll look at a diagram of that on a future slide. The second type of growth is called logistic growth. So populations typically begin with an exponential growth, but then as factors such as limited food supply or water supply or nesting sites start to come into play, then the growth of that population slows, and therefore it forms an S-shaped curve when graphed. So here's an example of a J-shaped curve or an exponential growth model curve. So here we have time on the x-axis, population size on the y-axis, and you can see it's rapidly increasing, so it looks like a J. However, when that population, which is experiencing growth rapidly or exponential growth in the beginning, if we just blocked off the top part of this curve, it starts to slow as the population size increases to a point where the factors in the environment, limiting factors, start to occur. And then eventually the growth of the population falls to zero. It levels off and would hopefully continue on at this capacity. That number is referred to as the carrying capacity. So carrying capacity can be defined as the limit of how large a population can be sustained by the limiting resources, especially food. Another way to define it, which is really the same, but the limit of how many individuals in a population the food supply can sustain, because it's usually the food that caps it off here. Now, sometimes species begin their growth with exponential growth, but organisms that might reproduce maybe once a year might overshoot the carrying capacity. And then when the next season comes along, the next spring, they have too many offspring for the particular habitat to sustain them. They don't have enough food for the size that the population has grown to, and so then that population will experience a die-off. And often what has happened in the past, there's an overshoot and then a die-off, and then a little bit of an overshoot again, a little bit of a die-off, and so forth, until eventually that population comes into balance with the carrying capacity for that population. But sometimes an overshoot results in a complete die-off of individuals. So for example, there were some reindeer introduced on an island that didn't have any predators. There were plenty of food. I believe they introduced maybe 25 of these reindeer. This was an island in Alaska back in 1910. And the population skyrocketed because there was plenty of food at first. Eventually, the population went from 25 all the way up to 2,000 reindeer. So 25 down here, all the way up to 2,000 quite rapidly. Unfortunately, because of the lower reproductive capacity, when they reached these critical levels, these critical overshoots, then the next spring, when the next set of offspring were born, there wasn't enough food for them, and the die-off wasn't just slight like this. They completely died off. Almost completely. They died off to a point where there were only 8 reindeer, and they since then have not really rebounded at all. So why do we care about growth models other than understanding populations? One of the reasons is that human population size is also constrained to the same extent as wild populations. And so that's something that we'll look at next week when we look at human population size and consider what might happen if we overshoot Earth's carrying capacity for the human population. So community ecologists study growth models. They also look at the interactions between different species within a community. So we will look at the 4 categories of species interaction next. Okay, they are competition, predation, commensalism, and mutualism. And I have future slides on each of those. So competition is when individuals from 2 different species struggle to obtain a limiting resource. So they compete with one another for that resource. So I forgot to hit the start button, so let me start this again. Competition is when individuals of 2 different species fight over or struggle over obtaining a limited resource. And there was a famous experiment conducted years ago by a scientist named Gauss, and this is Gauss's competition experiment. And in it, he had 2 closely related species of Paramecia. So Paramecia caudatum and Paramecia aurelia. And he put equal numbers of each of these Paramecia species into a petri dish to see what would happen. They both like the same types of foods, sugar, water conditions, etc. So would there be any factors, what would happen at the end of the experiment? Would after a certain number of days, let's say 24 days in this case, would both species still exist in equal numbers, or would one species outcompete the other, and if so, which one? And so he found that, in fact, at the end of the 24 days, that the Aurelia, the one down here in the second diagram, outcompeted completely the Caldatum. So they dominated the culture. And the reason was because they have a more rapid growth rate, reproductive rate, when nutrients are not limited. And it's faster growth rate than the Caldatum. So eventually, instead of having this one leveled off, but what happened when you put them together is this one died off. And my animation won't play for me, so I'll see if I can find you one for to post onto Moodle. But basically, his experiment demonstrated competitive exclusion, which means that often when two different species compete for the same limited nutrients, or limiting factors, then one species will outcompete the other. Okay, so that's written here on the next page. Competitive exclusion. They compete for the same resource, but they can't coexist. So one thing that can happen is that the other species simply dies off. But sometimes in nature, a second thing happens, and that's resource partitioning. So that means that the two species co-evolve so that the limited resource can be divided up. And they do that by through differences in their behavior or their form. A common example is shown here. A common example of resource partitioning is shown here, where you have two species. Usually we're talking about birds here. And this first species can eat seeds that are small and medium-sized, and the second species can eat seeds that are medium-sized and large-sized. But species 1 is a much more competitive species, a stronger competitor than species 2. So they get the bulk of these medium-sized seeds. And over time, the species here that dined, the individuals rather of the species that dined on the medium-sized seed won't survive as well. These that eat larger seeds will survive, and then over generations, species 2 will eat predominantly the larger size seeds, and species 1 gets the medium and small seeds. Okay, I'm going to pause here and go on to another screencast.